My name is Nia Washington. I am 32 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful cardiothoracic surgeon, I escaped their toxicity, but maintained a quiet distance. 3 years ago, my little sister Chloe told our parents that I dropped out of medical school and stole her tuition money to fund a drug habit. A lie that made them cut me off instantly. They threw me out in the freezing rain and they did not come to my residency graduation or my wedding. Last week, Chloe was rushed to my emergency room with a ruptured aortic aneurysm. When I walked in as her attending physician, my mother gripped my father's hand so tight it left bruises. Growing up in Atlanta meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. My childhood was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet, while my younger sister Chloe was the golden child. No matter how many honors I achieved, or how many late nights I spent studying, I was always the shadow to her blinding light. They bought her cars, paid for luxurious vacations, and eventually funded her lavish lifestyle while demanding I take out loans for medical school. But that pain was buried deep. Today, I was just a surgeon trying to save lives. The continuous deafening alarm of a flatlining heart monitor pierced the chaotic air of the emergency room at Atlanta Medical Center. It was a Tuesday evening, typically busy, but the noise coming from Trauma Bay 1 drowned out everything else. I was down the hall reviewing a post-operative chart when the overhead speaker blared a code red. A ruptured aortic aneurysm. Time was not just ticking, it was evaporating. I sprinted toward the scrub room, right next to the trauma bay. Through the large glass windows, I could see the frantic movements of the trauma team, blood soaked through the sterile sheets, and standing right in the middle of the room, actively hindering the nurses, were my parents. Pastor Thomas Washington and First Lady Vivian Washington. They were fully dressed in their Sunday best, having just come from a midweek church banquet. My father wore a tailored charcoal suit, his pastoral cross gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. My mother was wrapped in a silk emerald dress, her pearls clinging to her neck like a shield. Even in the face of death, they carried themselves with an unbearable arrogance. "Do not touch her with those incompetent hands!" My father's baritone voice boomed over the alarms, echoing into the hallway. "I demand the chief of surgery immediately. Do you know who I am? I am Pastor Thomas Washington. You are going to kill my daughter. Get the head of this hospital down here right now." Nurse Jenkins, a veteran trauma nurse who had seen everything, was physically trying to push my father back. "Sir, you need to step out of the room. Your daughter is bleeding into her chest cavity. We need to stabilize her." My mother shoved Nurse Jenkins hard in the shoulder. "You will not speak to my husband that way. We are not leaving Chloe with a bunch of interns. Call the chief of surgery. We have the money. We want the best." I pushed through the swinging doors of the scrub room, turning on the water with my knee. I grabbed the heavy antibacterial sponge and began aggressively scrubbing my hands and forearms. The cold water felt grounding. I had not seen them in 3 years. 3 years of absolute silence. They had erased me from their lives the night they chose Chloe's vicious lie over my truth. Yet here they were, demanding the very person they had thrown away. I kept my eyes locked on the mirror above the sink. I took a deep, stabilizing breath. I was not the terrified, heartbroken girl they had kicked out into the storm. I was a professional. I was the person holding the scalpel. I kicked the door of Trauma Bay 1 open. The heavy thud of the door hitting the wall made everyone in the room freeze for a fraction of a second. I stepped into the room, my arms raised, water dripping from my elbows. A resident quickly approached and helped me into my sterile yellow gown, snapping it shut behind my neck. My father turned his head, his face red with rage, ready to scream at whoever had just entered. His eyes locked onto mine. The breath physically left his lungs. He stumbled backward, his shiny dress shoes squeaking loudly against the bloody linoleum floor. "Vivian." He choked out the word, grabbing my mother by the arm and spinning her around. My mother's face went from furious to completely pale in a matter of seconds. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She stared at me as if I were a ghost, She looked at my scrubs, at the stethoscope around my neck, and at the authoritative way the trauma team parted to let me through to the operating table. "Get her out of here!" My mother suddenly shrieked, the shock morphing back into absolute hatred. "Security! Somebody call security right now. She has no right to be here. She is a disgraceful addict. She is a thief. Get her away from my daughter." Her voice cracked as she lunged forward, extending her manicured hands as if she was going to rip the sterile gown right off my body. Two security guards who had already been called to deal with my parents' disruptive behavior grabbed my mother by the shoulders and forcefully pulled her back. "Unhand me," she screamed, kicking her heels against the floor. "Thomas, do something. Do not let that junkie touch our baby. She will kill Chloe for revenge. She stole from us. She is high right now. Look at her." My father puffed up his chest, trying to use his massive frame to intimidate the room. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. "Nia, if you take one step closer to that operating table, I will have you arrested. I will sue this entire hospital into the ground. You are not a doctor. You are a dropout, a failure. I know for a fact you do not have a medical license." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply thrust my hands into the sterile gloves held open by the surgical tech. I snapped them over my wrists. I walked right past my screaming mother and my trembling father, stepping directly into the pool of Chloe's blood on the floor. I looked down at the table. Chloe was pale, her lips turning blue, her chest heaving sporadically as the ventilator forced air into her lungs. "BP is crashing, Dr. Washington." Nurse Jenkins said, her eyes fixed entirely on me, completely ignoring the screaming pastor in the corner. "Pressure is 60/40. We are losing her. Push 2 units of O negative and prep the massive transfusion protocol." I ordered, my voice steady, cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Get the OR ready. We have less than 10 minutes before her heart stops completely." "You are not listening to me," my mother shrieked again, fighting against the security guards. "This is my daughter. I have the right to refuse care. I refuse her. Get another surgeon." I finally stopped. I turned my head slowly and looked my mother dead in the eyes. The sheer volume of my silence commanded the entire room. Even the alarms seemed to quiet down under the weight of the tension. I looked at Nurse Jenkins. "Nurse Jenkins, would you please inform Pastor and First Lady Washington of the current surgical roster?" Nurse Jenkins stepped forward, her face a mask of pure professional ice. "Pastor Mrs. Washington, Dr. Nia Washington is our chief of cardiothoracic surgery. She is the youngest chief this hospital has ever had. She is the only board-certified trauma surgeon in the state of Georgia who specializes in complex aortic ruptures. If you refuse her care, your daughter will bleed to death in exactly 8 minutes. There is no one else to call." The silence that followed was deafening. My father's jaw literally dropped. The man who made his living giving booming sermons to 10,000 people every Sunday was completely speechless. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. The daughter he had thrown away like trash, the daughter he had slandered to his entire congregation, the daughter he swore would end up dead in a gutter, was the only human being on earth who could save his golden child. My mother stopped struggling against the guards. Her knees buckled slightly, her silk dress crumpling as she slumped against my father. She looked at my badge, the shiny gold lettering that read, "Dr. Nia Washington, Chief of Surgery." She stared at it as if it were written in a foreign language. Her breathing became shallow and panicked. I turned my attention back to my patient. I grabbed a penlight and checked Chloe's pupils, sluggish but reactive. I reached out and took the surgical consent clipboard from the resident's hands. I turned back around and held it out directly toward my father. "You wanted the chief of surgery, Pastor Thomas." I said, my voice carrying no warmth, no familial affection, just absolute clinical detachment. "You got her. Now you have exactly 3 minutes to sign this consent form. If you do not sign it, I will walk out of this room, I will grab a cup of coffee, and I will call the coroner instead of the anesthesiologist. The choice is yours." My father's large manicured hands reached out, hovering over the clipboard. He looked at me, searching my eyes for the scared little girl he had banished into the freezing rain 3 years ago. He was looking for the daughter who had begged him to believe her, who had cried on the front porch while he changed the locks. But he found nothing. My eyes were entirely vacant of any emotion toward him. I had excised him from my heart with the same precision I used in the operating room. "Nia, please." My mother whimpered, her voice entirely stripped of its former venom. She reached out to touch my arm, but I took a calculated step back, avoiding her grasp, as if she were carrying a contagious disease. "Do not touch my sterile gown, Vivian," I commanded sharply. The use of her first name hit her harder than a physical slap. She recoiled, covering her mouth with her hands. I tapped the pen against the metal clip of the board. "Tick-tock, Pastor. 2 minutes. Every second you spend hesitating is another ounce of blood your daughter loses. Do you want to pray about it, or do you want to act?" He snatched the pen from my hand. He hastily scribbled his signature on the bottom line, the paper tearing slightly under the pressure of his violent handwriting. He shoved the clipboard back into my chest, his eyes burning with a mix of utter humiliation and profound hatred. "If she dies on that table," he whispered, his voice trembling with dark malice, "I will destroy you. I will make sure you never practice medicine again." I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. I handed the clipboard to Nurse Jenkins. "If she dies on that table, Thomas, it will be because her body gave out. But if she lives, it will be because I decided to save her. And do not ever threaten me in my hospital again." I turned my back on them. "Let us move her. Now," I shouted to the trauma team. The room erupted into synchronized action. The residents and nurses grabbed the rails of the gurney, pushing it forward with maximum speed. I walked ahead of them, my clogs clicking sharply against the tile floor. We burst out of the trauma bay, leaving my parents standing alone in the middle of a blood-stained room, completely stripped of their power, their pride, and their illusions. They were no longer the esteemed leaders of a megachurch. They were just two terrified people who had just realized they were entirely at the mercy of the daughter they had discarded. The heavy double doors of the surgical wing swung shut behind my team, but the peace lasted for exactly 4 seconds. The sound of heavy footsteps pounding against the polished linoleum echoed down the corridor. My father had recovered from his initial paralysis and was now fueled entirely by wounded pride and sheer desperation. He physically pushed past the security guards stationed at the surgical perimeter, breaking every hospital protocol in the book. "Stop right there!" His baritone voice vibrated off the walls. "I am not finished with you." He caught up to us in the pre-operative staging area, just as we were transferring Chloe from the transport gurney to the operating table. The anesthesia team was already prepping the intubation tray. My mother was trailing right behind him, frantically clutching her silk purse and gasping for air. Her emerald dress swished loudly as she marched into the restricted zone. "You are not cutting into my daughter." My father pointed a trembling finger at me. "There has been a massive administrative mistake here. I know for a fact that you dropped out of medical school 3 years ago. You do not have the credentials to be a chief of surgery. You must have falsified your records. I demand to see the board of directors. Dr. Washington, we need to intubate immediately," the lead anesthesiologist said, ignoring my father completely and looking directly at me. "Do it," I ordered. "Do not touch her." My father roared, taking another aggressive step forward. "I am Pastor Thomas Washington. I lead a congregation of 10,000 people. I play golf with the mayor. I have the best lawyers in Atlanta on speed dial. I am revoking my consent right now. I demand you bring me the hospital administrator. I will sue this entire facility into bankruptcy if you let this drug addict touch my child." The sheer audacity of his delusion was almost impressive. Even with his golden child bleeding to death from the inside out, his primary concern was maintaining absolute control. He could not stomach the reality that the daughter he had cast out was now holding the ultimate power over his family. He wanted to bend reality to fit his narrative. I turned away from the operating table. I walked slowly toward my father, closing the distance until I was standing directly in his personal space. I looked up into his eyes. For 29 years I had cowered under that gaze. I used to tremble when he raised his voice. But today I felt absolutely nothing but clinical detachment. "You want to revoke your consent, Pastor?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Yes. He spat back, his chest heaving. Get me a real doctor. I snapped my fingers at the circulating nurse. Nurse, please print a standard against medical advice, discharge form, and a liability waiver. Pastor Washington is choosing to let his daughter die. My father flinched. What are you talking about? I leaned in closer. I am the only board-certified cardiothoracic trauma surgeon in this hospital tonight. The next closest specialist is at Emory, and it will take a helicopter 45 minutes to get her there. She does not have 45 minutes. She has about 4, so you can revoke your consent. But you have exactly 3 minutes to sign the liability waiver, or I will call the coroner right now instead of the anesthesiologist to declare time of death. My father swallowed hard. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. His bluff had been called in the most spectacular fashion possible. He looked past me at the monitors. Chloe's blood pressure was dangerously low. The rhythmic beeping was frantic and entirely unstable. This is a trick. My mother shrieked, stepping out from behind my father. Her pristine emerald dress was now stained with a few drops of her daughter's blood from leaning over the gurney earlier. She pointed a manicured nail directly at my face. You are doing this on purpose. You are trying to punish us for the past. Vivian, please step back, I said coldly. Do not tell me what to do. She hissed, her eyes wild with panic and venom. After what you did to us, you owe us. After you broke our hearts, you owe us her life. We gave you everything. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. We paid for your undergraduate degree. And you repaid us by stealing $150,000 of Chloe's tuition money to buy drugs. You owe us the surgery. The air in the pre-operative area went dead silent. The surgical nurses, the anesthesiologist, and the technicians all froze, looking between me and my mother. I could feel their eyes on me, but I did not break eye contact with the woman who gave birth to me. I reached out and snatched the clipboard with the original signed consent form right out of my father's hand. I do not owe you anything, I said, my voice slicing through the tension like a scalpel. You threw me out of your house in the middle of a thunderstorm. You stood on your manicured porch and watched me walk 3 miles to a gas station with nothing but the clothes on my back. You did not even let me grab my winter coat. You canceled my phone plan while I was still walking. You froze my bank account. You did not ask for my side of the story. You did not ask for bank statements. You just took the word of your perfect little angel over mine. My mother's breath hitched. She opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off instantly. So do not stand in my operating room and talk to me about family obligations. I do not owe you loyalty. I do not owe you forgiveness. But I took a medical oath. I swore to do no harm and to save lives regardless of who is lying on my table. I took an oath, Vivian. It is just too bad you and the good pastor never took yours seriously. My mother visibly recoiled as if she had been physically struck by my words. Her hand flew to her chest, clutching her pearls tightly. She looked at my father for backup, but he was completely silent, staring blankly at the floor. The righteous indignation had been thoroughly drained out of him, leaving only the pathetic reality of his current situation. I turned to the hospital security guards who had followed them down the hall. Escort the pastor and his wife to the surgical waiting room. If they try to breach the sterile doors again, call the Atlanta police and have them arrested for trespassing and interfering with a life-saving medical procedure. Yes, Dr. Washington, the taller guard said, stepping forward and grabbing my father firmly by the arm. Let us go, sir. My father did not resist this time. He let the guard pull him backward. My mother let out a loud, dramatic sob, grabbing my father's sleeve as they were escorted out of the restricted area. I watched them walk away, their shoulders slumped, their arrogant posture completely shattered. They were finally powerless. I took a deep breath, letting the toxic energy of my parents leave my body. I turned back to the surgical team. The monitors were still blaring. The situation was critical. All right, everyone, I announced, my voice projecting clearly across the room. We have a ruptured ascending aortic aneurysm. We are going to need to put her on cardiopulmonary bypass immediately. Let us get her chest open. I walked through the automatic doors into the freezing, sterile environment of operating room 4. The bright surgical lights blinded me for a fraction of a second before my eyes adjusted. Chloe was lying on the table, completely unconscious, the anesthesia already taking full effect. Looking at her pale face, I felt a strange sense of absolute detachment. This was the sister who had deliberately ruined my life. This was the girl who had lied flawlessly to protect herself, knowing it would completely destroy me. She had spent the last 3 years living in absolute luxury while I slept in my car and worked triple shifts to pay for my residency. She had everything handed to her on a silver platter. And yet here she was fighting for her life while I held the scalpel. "Scalpel," I said, holding out my right hand. The surgical tech slapped the cold metal instrument firmly into my palm. I made the first precise incision straight down the center of her chest. The room smelled strongly of iodine and metallic blood. The saw buzzed loudly as we opened the sternum, exposing the thoracic cavity. The amount of blood pooling in the pericardial sac was staggering. "We need to get her on bypass right now," I said, my voice calm but incredibly urgent. "Cannulate the right atrium and the ascending aorta." The bypass machine kicked in, taking over the function of her heart and lungs. The rhythmic whirring of the pump replaced the frantic beeping of the cardiac monitor. For the first time since she arrived in the emergency room, the situation was under my complete and total control. As I meticulously began to graft a synthetic tube to replace the ruptured section of the aorta, I noticed the severe inflammation surrounding the tissue. This was not a congenital defect. This was not a random stroke of bad luck. The vascular walls were incredibly friable, tearing easily under the slightest pressure. This kind of systemic damage was a textbook indicator of chronic stimulant abuse, specifically high-grade amphetamines. The irony was almost suffocating. The sister who had loudly accused me of being a drug addict was currently bleeding out on my table because her own body had given out from years of intense chemical abuse. "Suction," I commanded, keeping my hands perfectly steady as we clamped the aorta. While I was repairing the massive damage to Chloe's heart, I knew exactly what was happening out in the waiting room. My parents were likely pacing the floor, trying to keep up appearances for the hospital staff. They were probably making frantic phone calls to their church board, trying to control the narrative before the gossip spread. They had spent their entire lives cultivating a flawless public image. Pastor Thomas, the spiritual leader with the perfect family. First Lady Vivian, the epitome of grace and Southern elegance. Chloe, the beautiful, successful daughter with the wealthy husband. And Nia, the dark secret they had successfully buried. But the ground beneath their carefully constructed kingdom was crumbling fast. They were completely stripped of their control, forced to wait in agonizing silence, knowing that their entire world rested in the hands of the daughter they had completely discarded. They had no idea that the nightmare was just beginning, and that the arrival of their wealthy son-in-law would be the spark that burned their entire facade to the ground. The final stitch went in flawlessly. I stepped back from the operating table, letting out a slow, controlled exhale. The bypass machine was successfully weaned off, and Chloe's damaged heart was finally beating on its own again. It was a fragile rhythm, but it was stable. I looked up at the digital wall clock mounted above the observation window. We had been in the thick of it for nearly 3 hours, fighting against a relentless ticking clock of catastrophic internal blood loss. I instructed my senior resident to finish closing the chest cavity using the standard wire circlage and to prep her for immediate transport to the surgical intensive care unit. Stripping off my blood-soaked surgical gown and heavy latex gloves, I tossed them forcefully into the red biohazard bin. The physical exhaustion was beginning to set deeply into my shoulders, tightening the muscles in my neck, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I walked over to the stainless steel scrub sink and washed my hands, letting the freezing cold water run over my skin for a long moment. The surgical crisis was officially over, but the real operation, the dismantling of my toxic family, was just about to begin outside these sterile walls. I pushed through the heavy double doors of the restricted surgical wing and headed down the long, pristine corridor toward the main family waiting area. As the attending surgeon, it was my responsibility to deliver the standard post-operative update to the family. But long before I even reached the final corner, I could hear a loud, obnoxious voice echoing off the hospital walls. It was a voice I had not heard in 3 long years, but it still carried the exact same irritating cadence of unearned confidence and forced bravado. Jamal Davis had finally made his grand entrance. I paused just out of sight, leaning my shoulder slightly against the cold wall to observe the scene unfolding in the waiting room. Jamal burst through the main elevator doors, playing the role of the frantically devastated husband to absolute perfection. But his physical appearance told an entirely different story to anyone paying close attention. He was wearing a designer suit, but the fabric was heavily wrinkled and creased, as if he had been sitting slouched in a smoky lounge for the past 5 hours. Even from 20 feet away, the distinct, overpowering smell of expensive bourbon and incredibly cheap floral perfume wafted off his clothes, completely masking the sterile bleach scent of the hospital. His silk tie was loosened, his collar was unbuttoned, revealing a thick gold chain, and his eyes were heavily bloodshot. He did not look like a dedicated businessman who had rushed over from a high-level corporate boardroom to be by his dying wife's side. He looked exactly like a man who had been dragged out of a VIP nightclub booth in the middle of a weeknight bender. Yet my parents did not seem to notice, or perhaps they simply chose to ignore his horribly disheveled state. The moment Jamal walked into the room, my mother practically threw herself at him, sobbing dramatically into his wrinkled lapel. My father stood up quickly, completely abandoning his previous state of defeated humiliation from our earlier encounter. He clapped Jamal heavily on the shoulder, looking at him as if the Messiah himself had just walked into the emergency room. It was truly pathetic to witness their desperation. They were clinging to this man and his supposed immense wealth as their ultimate salvation, their ticket to maintaining their pristine public image. "Where is she?" Jamal demanded, his voice booming across the quiet waiting area, deliberately loud enough for the other anxious families and the busy nursing staff to hear. "Where is my wife?" I came as quickly as I could. I literally dropped a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate closing to be here. This hospital better be giving her the absolute best care available, or I swear to God I am buying this entire building and firing everyone in it by tomorrow morning. My mother sniffled, gripping his arm tightly, as if anchoring herself to his false promises. "Oh, Jamal, thank goodness you are finally here. It has been an absolute nightmare. Absolute torture. They took her into emergency surgery hours ago, and the staff here has been completely uncooperative and incredibly rude to us." Jamal puffed out his chest, adjusting his crooked, heavy gold watch with a flick of his wrist. "Uncooperative. Do they not know who we are? Do not worry, Vivian. I will handle this right now. I am not letting my wife recover in some standard cramped hospital room with the general public." He marched right up to the main reception desk, slapping his hand loudly against the polished wood counter. The young receptionist jumped slightly in her chair, her eyes widening at his aggressive posture. "Listen to me, sweetheart." Jamal sneered, leaning over the high desk to physically intimidate her. "My wife is Chloe Davis. She is currently in surgery. I am her husband, and I demand to speak to the hospital administrator right now. I want her moved to your premier VIP recovery suite the second she is wheeled out of the operating room. I want private nurses, I want a private chef, and I want round-the-clock security stationed at her door. Spare absolutely no expense." The receptionist typed nervously on her keyboard, trying to maintain her professional composure, despite the aggressive man leaning over her workspace. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled up Chloe's rapidly expanding medical file. "Sir, the VIP suites require pre-authorization and a significant security deposit for uninsured or out-of-network patients. I need to check her file first to verify your coverage before I can assign that specific luxury room." Jamal laughed, a loud barking sound that echoed harshly in the quiet space, making a nearby family turn and stare in disgust. "Deposit. Do I look like a man who worries about a security deposit? I am a crypto and commercial real estate investor. I make more money in a single day than you make in a decade sitting behind this tiny desk. Just get the damn room ready and bring me the financial paperwork. I do not have time to argue with low-level administration." This was exactly my cue. The performance had reached its peak and it was time to pull the curtain down. I pushed off the wall and walked around the corner, stepping directly into the center of the brightly lit waiting room. I was wearing my dark blue surgical scrubs, my expensive acoustic stethoscope draped casually around my neck, and my chief of surgery identification badge clipped securely to my chest pocket, catching the bright overhead light. Jamal turned around at the sharp sound of my clogs clicking against the floor. His eyes scanned my blue scrubs, and his lips immediately curled into a familiar, deeply condescending smirk. He had not seen me since the night my parents threw me out into the freezing rain, and in his incredibly narrow mind, I was still the disgraced dropout, the pathetic older sister who had ruined her life with a drug addiction. He had absolutely no idea what had transpired over the last 3 hours between me and my parents. He assumed I was just some low-level hospital worker, perhaps an orderly, or a junior nursing assistant who had somehow managed to beg for a menial job here. Well, well, well. Jamal clapped his hands together, taking a heavy step toward me. His breath was entirely foul, a sickening mixture of stale alcohol and cheap mints attempting to cover the liquor. Look who finally got a job. Fetching water and emptying bedpans now, are we, Nia? I guess this hospital really does hire absolutely anybody these days. My parents, who were standing right behind him, suddenly froze, as if they had been turned to solid stone. The color instantly drained from my father's face, leaving him a sickly shade of ashen gray, and my mother actually took a physical step backward, hiding partially behind a chair. They knew exactly who I was in this hospital now, but they were far too paralyzed by their own profound shame to warn their golden son-in-law. Jamal, completely oblivious to the sudden sheer terror radiating from my parents, kept talking, his voice dripping with arrogant sarcasm. Since you work here now, why do not you make yourself useful for once in your miserable life? Run down to the cafeteria and get my mother-in-law a fresh hot coffee. Then go tell your boss that Jamal Davis is here and I am paying cash for my wife's VIP suite. Chop chop, little nurse. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice in anger. I simply stood there radiating an aura of complete and utter professional dominance. I looked him up and down, taking in the cheap synthetic fabric of his supposedly designer suit, the scuffed leather of his unpolished shoes, and the desperate hollow look in his eyes that only a con artist wears when his massive lies are finally about to catch up with him. I reached into the front pocket of my scrub top and pulled out the preliminary hospital billing clipboard. I had personally asked the finance department to run the initial numbers while my resident was closing Chloe's chest. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward, closing the distance between us until he had to look down slightly to meet my unwavering gaze. I held my ground with the posture of someone who owned the very floor he was standing on. I simply smiled. It was a sharp, terrifyingly predatory smile that did not reach my cold eyes. I extended my right arm and pressed the heavy clipboard directly into his chest, forcing him to grab it or let it clatter loudly to the floor. Great. I said, my voice incredibly smooth and dangerously calm, perfectly projecting across the dead silent waiting room. The VIP deposit is exactly $50,000. Finance is straight down the hall to your left. Let us see if that crypto portfolio you constantly brag about is actually real. Jamal looked down at the clipboard. His bloodshot eyes scanned the itemized list of surgical fees, operating room costs, and the massive $50,000 cash deposit required up front for the luxury suite he had just loudly demanded. The smug, arrogant smirk vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a sudden, sickening wave of genuine panic. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as his hands began to visibly tremble against the cold metal edges of the clipboard. He looked back up at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. The great Jamal Davis, the supposedly wealthy savior of my family, was completely speechless. I watched the color drain from Jamal's face as his eyes darted across the itemized estimate. He opened his mouth again, but quickly snapped it shut, swallowing hard. Finally, his survival instincts kicked in, and he forced a loud, obnoxious laugh that sounded completely hollow. 50 grand! He scoffed, waving the clipboard in the air as if it were a minor inconvenience. Is that all? I thought you were talking about real money, Nia. I will have this handled in 2 minutes. Come on, Pastor Thomas Vivian. Let us go show this hospital how the Davis family operates. He turned sharply on his heel and marched down the brightly lit corridor toward the administrative wing. My parents exchanged a quick, relieved glance, their faith in their golden son-in-law momentarily restored by his sheer bravado. They hurried after him, their footsteps echoing loudly against the polished floor. I adjusted my stethoscope and followed them at a slow, leisurely pace. I had no intention of missing the impending collision between Jamal's massive ego and cold, hard reality. The finance department was located at the end of the hall behind a wide glass partition. Several administrative clerks sat behind computers processing admissions and discharges. I stood casually near a water cooler just outside the glass, watching the scene unfold like a silent movie. Jamal marched up to the counter, occupied by a seasoned billing specialist named Brenda. Brenda was a no-nonsense woman who had worked at Atlanta Medical Center for 20 years. She did not care if you were a celebrity, a politician, or a pastor. She only cared about cleared funds. Jamal slapped the clipboard loudly onto her counter. My wife is Chloe Davis. I am here to pay the $50,000 VIP room deposit. Run it. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy black metal credit card, tossing it onto the counter with an arrogant flick of his wrist. It landed with a loud, distinct clink. My parents stood right behind him, standing tall and proud. My father even puffed out his chest, looking around the waiting area to see if anyone was witnessing the immense wealth of his family. I noticed two nurses who attended my father's church standing near the elevator banks, watching the interaction with curious expressions. Brenda picked up the black card without a single change in her completely neutral expression. She typed Chloe's name into the system, pulled up the pending surgical account, and ran the card through the heavy terminal on her desk. The machine beeped a sharp, low tone. Brenda looked at the screen. Declined, she said flatly. Jamal's confident posture faltered for a fraction of a second. What? That is impossible. Run it again. The chip is probably dirty. I just bought a brand new Porsche with that card yesterday. Brenda sighed and wiped the chip on her sleeve before inserting it again. The machine processed for 3 agonizing seconds before emitting the exact same low beep. Declined, sir, she repeated, her voice carrying a little further this time. My father frowned, leaning slightly over Jamal's shoulder. Jamal, is everything all right? It is fine, Pastor. Jamal stammered, his voice pitching up half an octave. It is just a security freeze. You know how these high-security banks are. When you make a massive commercial real estate acquisition, they temporarily lock the accounts to prevent fraud. I just closed a $3 million deal this morning. The fraud department must have flagged the hospital charge as unusual activity. He frantically dug into his wallet, pulling out a silver platinum card and shoved it across the counter. Here, use this one. It is my backup travel account. Brenda took the silver card and swiped it. Beep. Declined. Jamal's hands started shaking. He pulled out a third card, a standard blue bank debit card. Run this one. Beep. Declined. The silence in the finance department was absolute. The 2 church member nurses by the elevators were now openly staring, their eyes wide with poorly concealed gossip. My mother's face turned a brilliant shade of crimson. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped her silk purse so tightly, her knuckles turned completely white. Sir, I have run 3 different cards from 3 different banks, Brenda said, her voice devoid of any sympathy. All of them are returning insufficient funds codes, not fraud alerts. Insufficient funds. That means there is no money in these accounts. That is a lie. Jamal shouted, slamming his fist against the counter. Your machine is broken. My accounts are loaded. Do you know who I am? Sir, please lower your voice, Brenda warned, gesturing to the security guard standing near the entrance. If you cannot provide the deposit, we will place your wife in the standard intensive care ward once she is out of surgery. Let me just verify her primary health insurance to cover the surgical costs. Jamal's eyes widened in sheer terror. Wait, no. Do not check the insurance. Just give me 10 minutes to call my wealth manager. But Brenda was already typing rapidly on her keyboard. She squinted at the screen and then looked up over her glasses, staring directly at my parents. Pastor Washington, I see here that Chloe is listed as a dependent under her husband's policy, but this premium plan was canceled 8 months ago, Brenda stated clearly. My father stepped forward, completely ignoring Jamal now. Canceled? What do you mean canceled? My daughter has top-tier coverage. Not according to the National Registry, sir. Brenda turned the monitor slightly so he could see the glaring red text. The policy was terminated due to severe non-payment. They missed 6 consecutive monthly premiums. As of right now, Chloe Davis is completely uninsured. The estimated cost for a complex aortic repair and a standard ICU stay is upwards of $300,000. My mother let out a small strangled gasp. She looked at Jamal, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute horror and dawning realization. Jamal, the man who claimed to own multiple commercial plazas. Jamal, the man who bragged about buying his wife diamond tennis bracelets. Jamal, the man whose lifestyle my parents had been secretly funding to keep up appearances. He was broke, worse than broke. He was a complete fraud who had let his wife's health insurance lapse while claiming to be a millionaire. Jamal took a step back, holding his hands up defensively. It is an administrative error, Vivian. I swear to you my accountant was supposed to pay those premiums. I will fire him tomorrow. I just need to make one phone call to my bank and clear this up. Just give me 10 minutes. He turned and practically sprinted away from the billing desk, pushing past the nurses and disappearing down the hallway toward the cafeteria. He was fleeing the scene of his own financial crime, leaving my parents standing at the counter completely exposed. The reality of the situation crashed down on my father. He looked at the 2 nurses from his congregation who were now actively whispering to each other. By Sunday morning, the entire 10,000-member church would know that the pastor's wealthy son-in-law could not even afford a hospital copay and that his golden daughter was uninsured. For a man whose entire identity was built on the perception of generational wealth and divine blessing, this was a fate worse than death. We need to pay this right now, my father hissed, grabbing my mother's arm. Vivian, do you have the emergency card, the one from the retirement trust? My mother looked at him as if he had lost his mind. Thomas, that money is for our retirement. It took us 20 years to save that. We cannot just drain $50,000 right now. What about the church renovations? Vivian, look around. My father whispered furiously, his teeth clenched tight. Sister Mary and Nurse Hopkins are standing right over there. If we do not pay this deposit right now, the entire congregation will know Jamal is broke. They will know we are exposed. Pay the deposit. We will force Jamal to wire us the money tomorrow morning when his accounts unfreeze. My mother's entire body trembled. She knew exactly what Jamal was now. The veil had been lifted. The excuses about frozen accounts and bad accountants were obvious lies. But the crushing weight of their public image forced her hand. She could not bear the thought of being pitied by the women in her social circle. She could not stomach the idea of being exposed as a fraud by association. With a look of pure, unadulterated venom directed at the hallway where Jamal had just fled, my mother unzipped her designer purse. Her hands shook violently as she pulled out a simple blue debit card. It was not a flashy metal card. It was the joint retirement account they had spent decades building. She handed it to Brenda, her eyes filling with tears of extreme resentment and profound humiliation. Run it. My mother choked out the words, tasting the bitter ashes of her own foolish pride. Run it for the full 50,000. Brenda took the card and swiped it. The machine processed for a moment and then printed a long receipt. Approved, Brenda said, tearing off the slip and handing it to my mother along with a pen. Sign at the bottom, please. My mother signed her name with aggressive, jagged strokes. She snatched her card back and shoved it into her purse. She turned around, her chest heaving as she stared at my father. They had just drained a massive portion of their life savings to cover the lies of a man they had chosen over their own flesh and blood. They had thrown me away for nothing. I stood quietly by the water cooler, watching their entire world begin to fracture. The financial facade had officially cracked, revealing the rot underneath. But I knew this was only the very first layer of the onion. Jamal's empty bank accounts were nothing compared to the medical reality I was about to deliver. I turned around, and headed back toward the surgical waiting area to prepare the next devastating blow. I walked slowly back toward the main surgical waiting room, my clogs echoing lightly on the pristine tile. The heavy air of the hospital seemed to press down on the corridors, but I felt entirely weightless. By the time I rounded the final corner, my parents were already back in their seats looking completely drained. My father was staring blankly at the beige wall, his posture slumped. My mother was clutching her expensive leather purse to her chest as if it were a life preserver. Jamal had slinked back into the room looking like a cornered animal, his previous bravado entirely evaporated. He sat as far away from my parents as the seating arrangement allowed, frantically tapping his foot against the floor and staring at his silent phone. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a scalpel. They were a shattered portrait of a perfect family struggling to maintain the illusion that they were not drowning. I stepped into the center of the room holding a thick manila folder containing Chloe's post-operative charts and the official laboratory results. My presence immediately commanded their attention. My father stood up, his face a mixture of lingering resentment and desperate anxiety. My mother simply stared at me, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. Jamal finally looked up, a nervous sweat breaking out across his forehead. They were waiting for me to tell them that their golden child was safely on the road to recovery, so they could pack up their remaining pride and go home. But I was not there to offer them false comfort. I was there to deliver the absolute truth. The surgery was a success, I said, my voice completely devoid of any familial warmth. I replaced the ruptured section of her ascending aorta with a synthetic graft. She is currently stabilized and being transferred to the surgical intensive care unit. She will remain on a ventilator for the next 24 hours to monitor her cardiac output and ensure the graft holds. My mother let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, pressing her hand against her chest. Oh, thank God. Thank you, Jesus. She closed her eyes and tilted her head back, whispering a prayer of gratitude. My father visibly relaxed his shoulders, dropping 2 inches. He looked at me, expecting the conversation to be over, expecting to resume his role as the untouchable patriarch now that the immediate physical danger had passed. But I did not break eye contact with him, and I did not step away. I took a step closer, holding the manila folder. "Do not thank God just yet, Pastor," I said sharply, cutting through my mother's prayer. A ruptured ascending aortic aneurysm in a 29-year-old woman with no congenital heart defects does not just happen by the grace of God. It is not a random medical anomaly. I pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder. It was printed on bright white hospital letterhead bearing the official stamp of the toxicology department. I held it out directly toward my father. "Read it," I commanded. My father hesitated, looking from the paper to my face and back again. He slowly reached out and took the document, his hands trembling slightly. "What is this?" my father asked, his voice low and defensive. "It is the comprehensive toxicology screen we ran right before we put your daughter on the bypass machine," I stated clearly, my voice carrying across the quiet room so Jamal could hear. "Read the highlighted section, Thomas. Read it out loud so your son-in-law can hear exactly why his wife almost bled to death on my operating table." My father adjusted his glasses, staring at the paper. His eyes scanned the medical jargon before stopping abruptly at the bright yellow highlighted line. His face went completely slack. He read the words, but his brain seemed to reject their meaning. "I do not understand," he mumbled. "What does this mean?" "It means your perfect golden child is a raging drug addict," I said bluntly, refusing to sugarcoat the reality. Her bloodstream was absolutely flooded with high-grade amphetamines, not just a recreational dose. This indicates severe long-term chemical abuse. Her vascular walls were completely inflamed and friable. The tissue surrounding her heart was tearing like wet tissue paper. Her body was under such extreme prolonged physical stress that her aorta simply gave out. My mother leaped out of her chair, her face twisting into a mask of pure denial. "That is a lie!" she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are lying. Chloe does not do drugs. She is a good Christian girl. She leads the youth ministry. You are just trying to ruin her reputation because you are jealous. You always wanted to destroy her. I did not flinch at her outburst. I just stared at the lab report in my father's hands. Numbers do not lie, Vivian, I said coldly, and neither does the massive structural damage to her heart. You threw me out of your house 3 years ago because you chose to believe a baseless lie about me being an addict. You did not ask for a single drug test. You did not ask for proof. But here is the proof about your favorite daughter printed in black and white by an independent state-certified laboratory. She has been abusing powerful stimulants for years. My father crumpled the edge of the paper, his knuckles turning white. He slowly turned his head to look at Jamal. The nervous sweat on Jamal's forehead had turned into a heavy sheen. He was pressed back against his chair, his eyes darting toward the exit. Thomas. My father growled, taking a menacing step toward the man he had been praising just an hour ago. What is going on in your house? What kind of marriage is this? Jamal held his hands up in a placating gesture. Pastor, listen to me. I did not know. I swear I had no idea she was taking anything. She said she was taking diet pills to lose weight for the church gala. I swear to you I did not know it was serious. You are her husband. My father roared, his voice echoing violently in the small space. You live in the same house. You share the same bed. How could you not know your wife is a drug addict? My father advanced on Jamal, grabbing the lapels of his wrinkled designer suit and hauling him roughly to his feet. You are supposed to be providing for her. My father yelled, shaking Jamal violently. Instead, you let her insurance lapse and turn into an addict right under your nose. What kind of man are you? The sheer terror of being exposed pushed him over the edge into aggressive retaliation. He shoved my father backward, breaking his grip. Do not you dare look at me and judge my marriage! Jamal shouted, his face twisted in ugly rage. You want to know why she is stressed out. You want to know why she is swallowing pills to keep herself awake and functioning. It is because of you two. My parents froze, stunned by the sudden vicious counterattack. Jamal pointed an accusing finger directly at my mother. She has been stressed because you two parasites will not stop begging us for money. Every single week it is another sob story. You need 10,000 for the church roof. You need 20,000 to host the pastoral retreat. You need cash to maintain your massive house because you are secretly drowning in debt. My mother gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Jamal, keep your voice down. She hissed, glancing frantically around the waiting room to see if anyone was listening. I will not keep my voice down, Jamal yelled, stepping toward her. You parade us around your congregation like we are your personal bank account. You put so much pressure on Chloe to look like the perfect wealthy daughter that she was literally working herself to death trying to keep up the charade. You two are the reason she is lying in that bed. You bled us dry. You drove her to this. The wholly perfect family had officially turned on each other. My father lunged at Jamal, his fists clenched, ready to strike. Jamal braced himself, raising his arms to fight back. My mother screamed, trying to pull them apart, her silk dress tearing at the seam. They were eating each other alive right there in the waiting room, destroying their public image. I watched the chaos unfold, my face a mask of calm indifference. The first domino had fallen, and the entire kingdom was collapsing exactly as it was meant to. I did not need to raise my voice to destroy them. They were doing the work for me, tearing down their own empire of lies brick by miserable brick. Jamal abruptly backed away from my father, pushing his hands through his messy hair. He turned on his heel and stormed to the far corner of the waiting room, sinking into a vinyl chair and burying his face in his hands. He looked completely defeated, a pathetic shadow of the arrogant man who had marched into the hospital demanding a VIP suite. My father stood frozen in the center of the room, his chest heaving rapidly as he tried to process the sheer magnitude of the disaster. Not only was his golden daughter a severe drug addict whose body had just failed her, but she was completely uninsured. The estimated $300,000 medical bill hung over their heads like an executioner's blade. And the son-in-law, who was supposed to be their financial savior, was actually a parasite who had bled them completely dry. My mother collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with trembling hands. "We are ruined, Thomas," she whimpered, her voice barely a whisper. "We just drained $50,000 from our retirement account just for the deposit. We have nothing left to pay the surgeon. We have nothing left to pay the hospital. If the congregation finds out about the drugs and the money, they will force you to resign. The church board will strip you of your title. We will lose the parsonage. We will lose everything we have built." "Do not panic, Vivian," my father snapped, though his own voice was shaking with thinly veiled terror. "I am still the pastor of a 10,000-member congregation. I have connections. I have wealthy friends. We just need a short-term bridge loan to cover these hospital expenses until I can figure out a way to liquidate some of Jamal's remaining assets." He glared across the room at Jamal. Assuming this useless fraud actually has any assets left to liquidate, he frantically dug his mobile phone out of his suit pocket and began pacing the length of the waiting room. He walked past me without making eye contact, retreating to a slightly secluded alcove near the vending machines. But the hospital corridor was quiet, and his desperate, hushed voice carried perfectly down the hall. I leaned casually against the nurse's station, crossing my arms over my chest and listening intently as the great pastor Thomas Washington began begging for his financial life. "Deacon Miller," my father said, forcing a hearty, confident tone that sounded painfully hollow. "Yes, it is Pastor Thomas. Listen, I hate to call you so late, but we have a bit of a family emergency. Chloe is in the hospital." "Yes, she had a minor cardiac event, but she is fine now. The issue is there was a mix-up with her insurance paperwork. I need a quick personal loan of about $50,000 just to cover the immediate out-of-pocket costs. I can pay you back with interest next month." There was a long pause as my father listened to the response. His forced smile slowly vanished, replaced by a tight grimace. "I understand, Deacon," he replied, his voice hardening. "Yes, I know I already borrowed $20,000 for the church roof repair last month. But this is a medical emergency for my daughter. Are you sure you cannot extend a line of credit?" "Hello?" He pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the screen in disbelief. Deacon Miller had hung up on him. My father cursed under his breath, swiping furiously on his screen to find the next contact. He dialed another number, pacing faster now, his leather shoes squeaking sharply against the polished floor. "Brother Harrison," he started again, his tone slightly more desperate this time. "Yes, Pastor Thomas here. I am in a bind. I need to ask a massive favor. I need to borrow some cash tonight. Yes, I know about the previous loan. Listen, Harrison, I am good for it. You know my family. We have generational wealth, we have properties." I listened as the conversation dragged on, the rejections becoming more blunt. Through his increasingly agitated whispers, the ugly truth of their financial ruins spilled out into the open. My parents had spent the last 3 years systematically draining their own wealth to maintain their pristine public image. They had secretly bailed out Jamal on 3 separate occasions when his supposed real estate flips had completely failed. They had taken out loans from their own church deacons, using the church building fund as collateral to keep Jamal's fake crypto investment firm afloat. They did all of this simply because they could not bear the social embarrassment of admitting their perfect daughter had married a con artist. They chose to finance a lie rather than face the truth. And now the well was completely dry. "Harrison, please listen to me," my father begged, his voice cracking. "If I do not come up with the rest of the money, this hospital is going to put a lien on my house. They are going to transfer my daughter to a public charity ward. I cannot let the community see her in a public ward. Just 10,000, 5,000, anything you can spare. I will preach whatever sermon you want on Sunday. I will put you on the executive board." Another pause followed by another agonizing rejection. My father slammed his fist against the vending machine, making the glass rattle loudly. He made 5 more phone calls. He called his fraternity brothers from college. He called local politicians he had endorsed. He even called a rival pastor across town, attempting to leverage some old favors. Every single one of them said no. The word had clearly already spread through their tight-knit social circles. People knew the Washington family was financially toxic. They knew my father was over-leveraged. The illusion of their massive generational wealth had finally shattered, and the rats were abandoning the sinking ship faster than he could dial their numbers. I watched him shrink with every single phone call. He was no longer the imposing spiritual leader who commanded thousands of people every Sunday. He was a broken, desperate old man, standing in a hospital hallway, begging for scraps from men who used to kiss his ring. This was the man who had looked me in the eye 3 years ago and told me I was a worthless drain on his resources. This was the man who had changed the locks on the front door while I stood on the porch in the freezing rain, begging him to look at my bank statements and see that I did not steal Chloe's tuition money. He had felt so powerful that night, completely secure in his wealth and his righteous judgment. But the universe has a very funny way of balancing the scales. My father slowly lowered the phone from his ear after the final rejection. His shoulders were hunched, his breathing heavy and ragged. He looked over at my mother, who was still sitting in the waiting room, staring blankly at the floor. She had heard enough of his hushed pleading to know that no one was coming to save them. They were entirely alone, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. I stepped away from the nurse's station and walked slowly toward him, making sure my clogs clicked loudly on the tile. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of profound exhaustion and simmering rage. "So, Pastor," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly even, "it looks like the collection plate is coming up a little empty tonight. Perhaps you should try praying a little harder. I hear the Lord provides for those who live righteous, honest lives." That was the final straw. The sheer humiliation of being mocked by the daughter he despised, coupled with the catastrophic destruction of his entire social standing, broke whatever remaining shred of self-control he possessed. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He let out a primal roar of frustration, lifting his expensive smartphone above his head and hurling it violently down the hallway. The device smashed directly into the solid concrete wall with a loud explosive crack, shattering into dozens of sharp pieces. The screen splintered and the plastic casing scattered across the polished floor, skidding all the way to the heavy double doors at the end of the corridor. My mother screamed at the sudden violent noise, jumping up from her chair. Jamal flinched, retreating further into his corner, terrified that my father's wrath would suddenly turn back onto him. Several nurses popped their heads out of the nearby triage rooms, their eyes wide with alarm. The heavy silence that followed the crash was deafening. My father stood there, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into tight fists, staring at the broken pieces of his phone, as if they represented his entire shattered life. But the silence did not last long. The heavy double doors at the end of the hallway swung open with a smooth, authoritative swoosh. The sound of confident, measured footsteps echoed down the corridor, completely cutting through the tension. I did not need to turn around to know exactly who had just arrived. I recognized that steady, purposeful stride anywhere. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped into the brightly lit hallway. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit cut flawlessly to his broad shoulders, a crisp white shirt, and a deep crimson tie. His polished Oxford shoes clicked with absolute precision against the tile, stepping right over the shattered remains of my father's phone without even glancing down. Flanking him on either side were two massive hospital security guards, their hands resting casually near their utility belts. It was Andre Jackson. He was the director of legal affairs for the entire Atlanta Medical Center network, a former corporate litigator who specialized in dismantling massive financial frauds, and most importantly, he was my incredibly brilliant, fiercely protective husband. My parents had absolutely no idea who he was. When Andre and I got married 2 years ago in a beautiful, intimate ceremony surrounded by our chosen family, we had mailed an invitation to my parents' home out of a fleeting sense of obligation. They had returned the envelope unopened with the words, "Return to sender." Not at this address, scribbled aggressively in my father's handwriting across the front. They had refused to acknowledge his existence, completely ignoring the fact that I had married one of the most powerful legal minds in the city. Now he was standing right in front of them, radiating an aura of absolute authority and cold, calculating power. He held a thick, pristine leather folder tucked neatly under his left arm. He stopped a few feet away from my father, looking at the older man with an expression of mild disgust, as if he were inspecting a particularly unpleasant stain on the hospital floor. Pastor Thomas Washington. Andre said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded instant respect. He did not ask it as a question. It was a statement of fact. My father quickly tried to compose himself, wiping the sweat from his forehead and puffing out his chest in a desperate attempt to reclaim some of his lost dignity. Yes, I am Pastor Washington. And who exactly are you? Are you hospital administration? Because I demand an explanation for the unacceptable treatment my family has received in this facility tonight. Andre did not smile. He simply raised an eyebrow, looking my father up and down. No, Pastor. I am not general administration. I am the man who is about to explain exactly how much trouble your family is really in. My father narrowed his eyes at the man standing before him. To Pastor Thomas Washington, anyone wearing a suit in a hospital was either a grieving relative or a bureaucrat looking to collect a debt. Given the frantic phone calls he had just made, and the massive uninsured medical bill looming over his head, he immediately assumed Andre was the latter. A high-level collections officer sent down to secure the hospital's financial interests before the family could slip away into the night. My father straightened his spine, attempting to summon the last remaining shreds of his pastoral authority. He puffed out his chest, his large frame towering over the shattered pieces of his phone on the floor. He pointed a thick finger at Andre, his voice booming, with the practiced cadence of a Sunday morning sermon. "Now you listen to me, young man," my father bellowed, stepping forward to close the distance. "I do not care what your title is, and I certainly do not appreciate you ambushing my family in our darkest hour. My daughter just underwent emergency open heart surgery. We have already paid your ridiculous $50,000 deposit. If you are here to harass me about the rest of the bill, you can turn right around and march back to your office. I am Pastor Thomas Washington of the Greater Grace Fellowship. I shepherd a flock of 10,000 souls in this city. You will not intimidate me with your legal threats. We will set up a payment plan when my accountant reviews the itemized charges on Monday morning." Andre did not flinch. He did not step back. He simply watched my father with the calm, analytical gaze of a predator, observing a particularly loud but entirely harmless prey. He let my father finish his grand speech, allowing the empty threats to hang in the sterile hospital air for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then Andre slowly opened his pristine leather folder. "I assure you, Pastor, I am not here to negotiate a payment plan." Andre said, his voice dangerously quiet, forcing my father to lean in slightly to hear him. "And I am not here to collect a debt. At least not the one you are currently thinking about." My mother stepped out from behind my father, her eyes darting nervously between the two men. "Then who are you?" she demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. "Why are you harassing us? We do not even know you." Andre slowly closed the folder and looked directly at my mother. The corners of his mouth twitched upward in a humorless smile. "That is entirely your own fault, Vivian," Andre replied smoothly. "You would know exactly who I am if you had bothered to open your mail 2 years ago." My parents exchanged a confused, panicked look. Jamal, who had been hiding in the corner, slowly stood up, sensing the massive shift in the room's power dynamic. Andre buttoned his suit jacket and took one deliberate step closer to my parents. "I am Andre Jackson. I am the Director of Legal Affairs for the Atlanta Medical Center Network. But more importantly, I am the man whose wedding invitations you so graciously returned to sender with the words, 'Not at this address,' scribbled across the front in red ink. I am Nia Washington's husband." The reaction was instantaneous and entirely physical. My father actually staggered backward, his shiny dress shoes slipping slightly on the polished tile. All the air left his lungs in a sudden sharp wheeze. His face drained of whatever color had returned, leaving him looking sickly and incredibly old. My mother gasped, covering her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock. They stared at Andre, absorbing the reality of his custom-tailored suit, his confident posture, and the immense institutional power he represented. The daughter they had thrown away like garbage had not just survived, she had thrived. She had become the chief of surgery, and she had married the director of legal affairs. We owned the very ground they were currently standing on. You, my father stammered, completely unable to form a coherent sentence. You are married to Nia. Yes, Andre answered, his tone utterly devoid of warmth. And I have spent the last 2 years listening to my brilliant, beautiful wife wake up from nightmares because of the trauma you inflicted on her. I know every single detail about the night you kicked her out. I know about the missing tuition money. I know about the brutal things you said to her. So let us drop the righteous pastor act right now, Thomas. It does not work on me. For a moment there was complete silence. The magnitude of their catastrophic miscalculation crashed down on my parents. They were entirely at our mercy. Nia held Chloe's physical life in her hands, and Andre held their financial and legal fate in his. Then my mother did what she always did when backed into a corner. She completely flipped her script. The haughty, arrogant First Lady vanished in the blink of an eye. She immediately adopted the persona of a fragile, heartbroken mother desperate to heal her fractured family. She took a step toward Andre, her eyes welling up with perfectly timed tears. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, looking up at him with an expression of pure, manufactured innocence. "Oh, Andre," my mother cried, her voice trembling with artificial emotion. "We had no idea. We were so blinded by our own grief and confusion back then. We made a terrible mistake with Nia. We were just trying to protect Chloe. You have to understand a parent's heart. We have suffered so much missing our eldest daughter." Andre stared at her, his expression completely unchanged. He did not buy a single word of her performance. My mother took another step closer, reaching out to gently touch Andre's sleeve. He smoothly shifted his arm, completely avoiding her grasp. She awkwardly pulled her hand back but kept pushing forward with her manipulation. "We are family, Andre," she pleaded, her voice dripping with sickly sweet desperation. "You are our son-in-law. Family is everything. God tells us to forgive those who trespass against us. We need to heal this rift. We need to come together right now to support Chloe. And Andre, we are in such a terrible financial bind. Jamal's accounts are frozen. The medical bills are going to be astronomical. Surely, as the legal director and as our family, you can speak to the hospital board. You can have these mounting surgical fees waived. It would be a gesture of goodwill, a fresh start for all of us." My father quickly caught on to her strategy. He nodded vigorously, straightening his posture and attempting a weak conciliatory smile. "Yes, Andre, Vivian is absolutely right. We are all men of God here. We need to focus on forgiveness. If you could just make this massive hospital bill disappear, we can put the past behind us. We can welcome you and Nia back into the family with open arms. We will even host a special dinner at the parsonage in your honor." The sheer audacity of their request was staggering. They had not seen my face in 3 years. They had just spent the last hour actively insulting me and trying to get me removed from the operating room. They had drained $50,000 of their own retirement money because they refused to admit their golden son-in-law was a fraud. And now, less than 2 minutes after discovering Andre's identity, they were trying to use his marriage to the daughter they despised to secure a $300,000 financial favor. They did not care about me. They did not care about getting to know Andre. They only cared about saving their own skin and maintaining their precious bank accounts. I watched Andre from the end of the hall, feeling a deep surge of pride. I knew exactly how he was going to respond. Andre let out a short, dark laugh. The sound was entirely devoid of humor, and it instantly shattered my parents' fragile hopes. "Welcome us back into the family." Andre repeated the words, tasting bitter on his tongue. "Pastor Washington, First Lady." "Vivian, I think you severely misunderstand the current situation. I did not come down here to seek your blessing. I did not come here to join your toxic little family, and I certainly did not come here to abuse my executive authority to erase the massive debt you are about to incur." My mother's fake tears instantly vanished, replaced by a hard, defensive glare. "But you are family." She snapped, her true colors bleeding through the facade. "You are obligated to help us. I am obligated to protect this hospital from financial fraud. Andre countered, his voice hardening into absolute steel. And right now, your family represents a massive liability. Andre turned his gaze past my parents, locking eyes with Jamal, who was still cowering in the corner. Jamal had been trying to make himself as small as possible, hoping the conflict between Andre and my parents would allow him to slip out unnoticed. But Andre's sharp eyes pinned him right to the vinyl chair. "Mr. Davis," Andre called out, his voice echoing down the corridor. "Do not think you are flying under the radar here." Jamal flinched, looking around nervously as if searching for an escape route. "What do you want with me?" "I did not do anything. I am just waiting for my wife." Andre opened his pristine leather folder once again. He pulled out a thick stack of documents printed on heavy legal paper. "As the Director of Legal Affairs, it is my job to mitigate risk when high-value uninsured patients are admitted to our VIP wards. When you aggressively demanded our luxury suite and then miraculously failed to provide a valid form of payment, I ran a standard expedited financial background check to determine your liability status." Jamal's face drained of all color. He jumped up from his chair, his hands shaking. "You cannot do that. That is an invasion of privacy. I am going to sue you." "You cannot afford to sue me, Jamal," Andre stated flatly, tapping the stack of papers. "Because according to these federal filings, you do not own a single commercial property. Your cryptocurrency investment firm is registered to a post office box in Delaware and has absolutely zero reported assets. The luxury sports car you claim to have bought yesterday is a short-term, high-interest lease that is currently 2 full months past due." My parents whipped around to stare at Jamal, their mouths hanging open in absolute horror. The rumors, the declined cards, the hushed phone calls, it was all completely true. "And that is not even the worst part." Andre continued, ignoring Jamal's pathetic protests. "The reason I am standing here tonight is not to collect a simple hospital bill. It is to inform you that your entire financial house of cards is about to collapse on top of this family. I have the receipts, Jamal. I have every single one of them, and we are going to go through them right now, line by line, until the truth is completely exposed." Andre stepped past my paralyzed parents and walked deliberately toward the small, scuffed coffee table sitting in the center of the waiting room seating area. He did not smile. He did not break eye contact with Jamal, who was trembling so violently, his knees knocked together. Andre unclasped his pristine leather folder and pulled out a thick stack of printed financial documents, dropping them onto the table with a heavy thud. The sound made my mother jump backward, clutching her purse tightly against her chest. "When you marched into the billing department, making loud, aggressive demands for our premier VIP suite and promising to pay cash, you triggered a very specific hospital protocol." Andre began, his voice calm, methodical, and dripping with authority. "Atlanta Medical Center does not offer luxury accommodations to uninsured patients based on verbal promises and cheap suits. We require verified liquid assets. So as the Director of Legal Affairs, I personally authorized a comprehensive expedited financial background check to verify your extravagant claims." Jamal shook his head frantically, taking a hesitant step backward. "You hacked my accounts. This is illegal. You have absolutely no right to look into my private business operations. I will have your job for this." Andre let out a cold, dismissive breath, completely unbothered by the empty threat. "It is completely legal, Jamal, when you explicitly offer your non-existent assets as collateral for a $300,000 medical procedure. Everything in this file is public record if you know where to look. And what our investigators found was not a commercial real estate empire. It was a poorly constructed, incredibly desperate Ponzi scheme." Andre picked up the top document, holding it up so my parents could see the glaring red foreclosure stamp printed across the top margin. "Let us start with your primary residence. The sprawling luxury estate in Buckhead you love to boast about at church gatherings. The house my in-laws believe you own outright. You do not own it. You have been renting it on a month-to-month lease, which you defaulted on 4 months ago. The formal eviction notice was filed last week. You and Chloe were going to be physically removed from the premises by the county sheriff on Friday morning." My mother let out a strangled gasp, sinking heavily into a nearby vinyl chair. "No, that is impossible." She stammered, her eyes wide with denial. He hosted our church leadership retreat there just last month. He catered the entire event. He hosted it with money he stole from other unsuspecting investors, Vivian. Andre corrected her sharply, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. He picked up another document. Here are the corporate filings for his cryptocurrency investment firm. It is registered in Delaware to a virtual post office box. There is no physical office. There are no employees. He has reported zero taxable corporate income for the last 3 consecutive years. The only money moving into this shell account comes from individual private investors. Investors he actively recruits from your own congregation, Pastor Thomas. And the money does not go into crypto. It goes directly to paying off his previous investors, just enough to keep them quiet, while he pockets the rest to fund his leased Porsche and his failing, pathetic lifestyle. My father stood perfectly still, his skin turning an alarming shade of gray. His eyes were completely glazed over, staring at the stack of documents as if they were venomous snakes ready to strike. He could not speak. The cognitive dissonance was simply too massive for his brain to process. Andre kept going, mercilessly peeling back the layers of Jamal's pathetic fraud. Your credit score is hovering in the low 400s. You have 3 different civil judgments against you for unpaid contractor fees. That expensive diamond tennis bracelet you bought Chloe for her birthday last year was purchased on a high-interest store credit card that was sent to collections 90 days later. You are completely entirely broke, Jamal. In fact, factoring in your outstanding liabilities, you have a negative net worth of nearly $2 million. Shut up! Jamal suddenly screamed, his voice cracking in sheer panic. Shut your mouth right now! The overwhelming humiliation finally snapped the last thread of Jamal's sanity. Realizing that his entire fake life was over and that the wealthy in-laws he relied on were now looking at him with absolute murder in their eyes, Jamal lost total control. He let out a feral yell and lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight toward Andre. His hands stretched out desperately, trying to grab the financial documents from the table and perhaps tear them to shreds, as if destroying the paper would somehow magically erase his monumental crimes. He never even made it within 2 feet of my husband. The 2 massive hospital security guards flanking Andre moved with terrifying lightning speed. The guard on the left stepped squarely in front of Andre, absorbing Jamal's forward momentum with a solid, effortless shoulder block. The guard on the right grabbed Jamal by the collar of his wrinkled suit jacket and the back of his belt, lifting him almost entirely off his feet. With one synchronized, incredibly forceful motion, they threw Jamal backward. Jamal flew through the air and crashed violently into a heavy vinyl waiting room chair. The chair slid backward, scraping loudly against the tile floor before slamming into the plaster wall. Jamal collapsed into the seat, gasping for air as the breath was completely knocked out of his lungs. One of the security guards immediately stepped forward and pressed a heavy hand firmly against Jamal's sternum, pinning him securely to the chair. Do not move again, sir. The guard warned, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed in the quiet room. Or I will place you in handcuffs right now and personally drag you to the police precinct across the street. Jamal stayed completely frozen, his eyes wide with terror, staring up at the giant guard holding him down. His chest he heaved rapidly, but he did not dare utter another word. He was physically and financially neutralized. Andre smoothed the lapel of his charcoal suit, perfectly unbothered by the sudden burst of violence. He calmly adjusted his cuffs and looked over at my father. My father was not looking at Jamal. He was gripping the back of a waiting room chair so tightly his knuckles were stark white. His breathing had become incredibly shallow and his chest was rising and falling in erratic, jagged bursts. His mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. A thin layer of cold sweat coated his forehead. Thomas. My mother cried out, noticing his severe physical distress. Thomas, what is wrong with you? Speak to me. My father did not answer her. He slowly raised his heavy head and looked directly at Andre. When he finally spoke, his booming pastoral voice was reduced to a fragile, broken whisper that barely carried across the room. The building fund. My mother froze her face, instantly losing all expression. What? My father turned to her, his eyes wide with absolute horror and a devastating, soul-crushing realization. The church building fund, Vivian. The $100,000 we raised from the congregation for the new youth center. Last month, Jamal came to me privately. He said he had an exclusive real estate flip, a guaranteed off-market deal. He said he could double the church's money in 30 days. I gave it to him. I wired him the entire $100,000 from the church escrow account without telling the deacon board. My mother let out a piercing, horrified scream, covering her ears as if trying to block out the words. You gave him the church's money. Thomas, that is embezzlement. If the board finds out, you will go to federal prison. We will lose everything. I gave it to him because you kept telling me he was a financial genius. My father roared back suddenly, pointing a shaking finger directly at my mother's face. You kept telling me we needed to trust our son-in-law. You said keeping the investment money within the family was a divine blessing. I only gave it to him to cover the massive financial hole we already dug when we bailed him out the first 2 times. They were unraveling completely. The Holy United Front they had presented to the world for 30 uninterrupted years was dissolving right before my eyes into a bitter, toxic pool of mutual blame and criminal liability. My father clutched his chest, his face contorting in genuine physical pain as the crushing weight of his monumental stupidity crashed down upon him. He had not just bankrupted his family. He had stolen money from his own devoted congregation to feed a Ponzi scheme run by a man who could not even pay a standard hospital copay. Andre watched their spectacular collapse with absolute clinical detachment. He picked up the last piece of paper from the coffee table, holding it delicately between his fingers. $100,000. Andre repeated, shaking his head slowly in mock sympathy. That is incredibly unfortunate, Pastor. Because according to these audited bank statements, the exact moment that $100,000 hit Jamal's account, it was immediately dispersed to offshore sports betting sites and high-end casinos in Las Vegas. The money is completely gone. There is no real estate flip. There is no new youth center. There is only a massive federal wire fraud investigation waiting to happen. My father let out a pathetic whimpering sound, sinking to his knees right there on the hospital floor. The great pastor Thomas Washington was brought entirely low, completely ruined by his own blind arrogance and superficial greed. He had valued the appearance of wealth and high social status over everything else in his life. He had chosen a flashy, charismatic con artist over his own hardworking, brilliant daughter. He had thrown me out into the freezing street because he desperately wanted to believe a ridiculous lie designed to protect this exact parasite. And now the parasite had completely devoured him from the inside out. Jamal sat pinned in his chair, sobbing quietly into his hands, his false bravado entirely stripped away. My mother stood paralyzed, her hands hovering near her face, completely unable to process the total destruction of her entire social and financial existence. And my father knelt on the cold floor, clutching his chest, a broken, disgraced man facing absolute ruin. I stood silently near the nurse's station, a few yards away, watching my husband expertly dismantle the people who had actively tried to destroy me. It was a masterclass in absolute righteous retribution, delivered without ever raising his voice. The sheer poetic justice of watching their superficial world implode was incredibly satisfying. But the autopsy was not quite finished. Andre had laid bare the financial crimes and the gross negligence, but the true emotional betrayal, the foundational lie that had torn our family apart 3 years ago, was still waiting to be dragged into the unforgiving light. The stage was perfectly set for the final devastating blow. I pushed off the edge of the nurse's station and walked slowly toward the center of the waiting room. The sharp clicking of my clogs against the pristine tile floor drew the attention of everyone in the room. My mother looked up from her paralyzed state, her eyes darting from Andre to me. The sheer desperation in her gaze was pathetic. Now that her wealthy son-in-law was exposed as a complete fraud, and her husband was kneeling on the floor facing federal prison, she was desperately searching for a new savior. She saw my scrubs, my badge, and the unwavering support of my powerful husband, and she immediately tried to pivot. "Oh, Nia!" My mother cried out, her voice cracking as she stumbled forward. Her silk emerald dress was stained and wrinkled, completely stripped of its former elegance. She reached out her trembling hands toward me, tears streaming down her face. Nia, you have to help us. You heard what Andre just said. Jamal has completely ruined us. He lied to us. He manipulated your father. He stole from the church. He is a monster. We are victims in all of this. Please, Nia, you are a doctor here. You have influence. You can help us sort this out. We are your family. I did not move a single muscle to comfort her. I let her hands hang awkwardly in the empty space between us until she finally dropped them to her sides in complete defeat. You are not a victim, Vivian, I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register. You are a willing participant. You chose to close your eyes to the truth because the lie looked better on Sunday morning. Andre stepped smoothly between us, shielding me completely from my mother's toxic presence. He looked down at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. Do not ever try to touch my wife again. Andre warned, his voice slicing through the heavy air like a razor blade. And do not dare stand there and pretend you are an innocent victim of Jamal's deceit. Because Jamal's financial crimes against your family did not start with the church building fund last month. They started 3 years ago, and you were the ones who handed him the weapon. My father, who was still kneeling on the floor clutching his chest, slowly looked up. What are you talking about? He wheezed, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. We did not know Jamal 3 years ago. Chloe had only just started dating him. Andre reached into his pristine leather folder one final time. The atmosphere in the waiting room shifted, becoming incredibly dense and suffocating. This was the moment I had waited 3 agonizing years for. This was the vindication I had prayed for while sleeping in the freezing backseat of my car, while working grueling triple shifts at the hospital, while crying myself to sleep wondering why my own parents hated me so much. When I initiated the asset investigation into Jamal, I instructed my team to go back exactly 36 months. Andre explained, holding a single heavily redacted banking document in his right hand. I wanted to see the exact origin point of his financial relationship with your daughter. I wanted to see when the bleeding actually started. And what I found was a massive influx of cash into a highly secured offshore account located in Antigua. Andre walked over to my father and dropped the piece of paper directly onto the floor in front of his knees. Look at the date, Thomas, Andre commanded. Look at the exact date and the exact dollar amount of that wire transfer. My father's trembling hands reached out and picked up the paper. He adjusted his glasses, squinting at the small black text printed across the official bank letterhead. His eyes scanned the numbers and then stopped completely. His breath hitched violently in his throat. $150,000. My father whispered the number, echoing in the dead silent hospital corridor. It was transferred on October 12th. My mother let out a sharp gasp, stepping back as if the paper was physically burning her. October 12th, she repeated, her voice shaking uncontrollably. That was the day before. That was the day before you kicked my wife out of your house. Andre finished the sentence for her, his voice booming with righteous fury. That was the day Chloe came crying to you, claiming that her entire medical school tuition fund was missing. That was the day she pointed her finger at Nia and told you she had stolen the money to buy drugs. My father looked from the paper to Jamal, who was still pinned against the waiting room chair by the security guard. Jamal was openly weeping now, shaking his head back and forth in a pathetic attempt to deny the undeniable reality. Andre pointed a sharp finger directly at Jamal. 3 years ago, Jamal owed a massive debt to an illegal sports betting syndicate. They were threatening to break his legs. He was desperate, so he convinced his brand new girlfriend, your perfect golden child Chloe, to bail him out. No, my mother shrieked, covering her ears. No, Chloe would never do that. She wanted to be a doctor. That was her tuition money. Chloe never wanted to be a doctor, Vivian. I finally spoke, stepping out from behind Andre to deliver the absolute truth. She only applied to medical school because you and Thomas forced her to. She failed her entrance exams twice. She was terrified of disappointing you. So when Jamal needed money, she saw the perfect way out. She could give him the tuition money, play the victim, and escape the pressure of medical school all at the same time. Andre tapped the banking document in my father's hands. Look at the authorizing signature at the bottom of the wire transfer, Thomas. The bank requires a verified physical signature for offshore transfers of that magnitude. It is not Nia's signature. It is Chloe's. Your golden daughter walked into that bank branch, looked the teller dead in the eye, and voluntarily wired every single penny of her own tuition fund directly into Jamal's gambling account. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. My father stared at the signature on the paper, the familiar sweeping cursive of his youngest daughter, the absolute definitive proof of her ultimate betrayal. She orchestrated the entire thing. Andre continued, his voice relentless, pounding the truth into their skulls. She wired the money to her boyfriend. Then she came home and put on a spectacular performance for you. She knew you already resented Nia for being smarter, more independent, and less easily controlled. She knew you would jump at the chance to tear Nia down, so she handed you the perfect excuse, and you took it. I said, my voice breaking slightly, but I forced it to remain steady. I stared directly into my father's eyes. You took her word without a single shred of evidence. I stood on the front porch in the freezing rain and begged you to look at my bank statements. I begged you to call the police and file a report so they could investigate the missing funds. I begged you to drug test me right there on the spot, but you refused. My father dropped the paper. His hands fell limply to his sides. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a level of agony and regret that I had never seen before. Nia, he whispered, his voice completely broken. We did not know. You did not want to know. I snapped back, the years of suppressed rage finally bleeding into my words. It was easier to blame me. It was easier to call me a junkie and throw me away than to admit your perfect parenting was a complete failure. You sacrificed your innocent daughter to protect a lie. You let me sleep in my car during the dead of winter. You let me starve. You missed my graduation. You missed my wedding. You missed everything because you were too arrogant to admit you might be wrong. My mother fell to her knees right beside my father, her silk dress pooling around her on the cold, sterile floor. She reached out and grabbed the hem of my surgical scrubs, sobbing hysterically. I am so sorry. She wailed, her tears staining the blue fabric. Oh God, what have we done? We threw away our own flesh and blood. Please, Nia, forgive us. We were blind. We were so incredibly blind. I looked down at the two people who had given me life and then systematically tried to destroy it. They were no longer the powerful, imposing figures of my childhood. They were just two broken, aging hypocrites kneeling on a hospital floor, completely surrounded by the wreckage of their own terrible choices. I gently but firmly pulled the fabric of my scrubs out of my mother's desperate grasp. I took a step back, putting physical and emotional distance between us. Your apologies mean absolutely nothing to me now, I said, my voice returning to its cold, clinical baseline. You are only apologizing because you got caught. You are only crying because the man you chose over me just stole your retirement fund and bankrupted your church. If Jamal was actually a millionaire, you would still be calling me a drug addict today. My father buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, heavy sobs. The destruction of his pride was absolute. I turned to Andre. He gave me a single affirming nod, a silent communication of unwavering support and deep protective love. We had delivered the truth. We had exposed the rot at the core of my family. The surgical removal of their toxic influence was almost complete. At that exact moment, the heavy double doors of the surgical intensive care unit swung open down the hall. A critical care nurse stepped out, looking directly at me, holding a clipboard. Dr. Washington. The nurse called out, her voice echoing in the quiet corridor. The patient is waking up. She is extubated and conscious. My parents immediately snapped their heads up, their tear-streaked faces turning toward the intensive care unit. Chloe was awake. The architect of this entire nightmare was finally conscious. I looked down at my parents one last time. You wanted to see your daughter, I said coldly. Well, she is awake. Let us go see what she has to say for herself now that her entire world has burned completely to the ground. We followed the critical care nurse down the brightly lit corridor toward the surgical intensive care unit. My father walked with a heavy, dragging limp, as if the revelation of the offshore wire transfer had physically broken the bones in his legs. My mother trailed slightly behind him, her silk emerald dress looking completely ruined, her posture permanently hunched. They did not speak a single word to each other. The frantic energy of their earlier panic had been entirely replaced by a hollow, devastating silence. They were walking toward the daughter they had worshipped for 29 years, but they were no longer walking toward a savior or a golden child. They were walking toward a stranger who had meticulously orchestrated their absolute financial and social destruction. Andre walked close beside me, his hand resting gently on the small of my back, providing a steady, grounding presence. I felt completely invincible. The ghosts of my past were finally being exorcised in the harsh fluorescent lighting of my own hospital. We reached the heavy glass doors of the ICU. The nurse swiped her badge and the doors slid open with a soft mechanical hum. The unit was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors and the soft whoosh of ventilators. We walked past several glass-walled rooms until we reached room 4. The nurse pushed the sliding glass door open and stepped aside to let us enter. Chloe was lying in the center of the bed, elevated at a slight angle. The thick plastic endotracheal tube had already been removed from her throat, but she was still hooked up to a maze of intravenous lines and a heavily monitored chest tube. Her face was incredibly pale, stripped of the expensive makeup she usually wore like a mask. She looked small and frail, entirely unlike the confident, arrogant woman who had sneered at me 3 years ago. The cardiac monitor above her head beeped a steady, reassuring rhythm, indicating that the synthetic graft I had painstakingly sewn into her aorta was holding perfectly. My parents stepped hesitantly into the room, stopping at the foot of the bed. They did not rush to her side. They did not reach out to stroke her hair or hold her hand. They just stood there, staring at her with hollow, empty eyes. A few seconds later, Chloe's eyelids fluttered. She let out a soft, raspy groan, shifting slightly against the sterile white hospital sheets. She opened her eyes, blinking against the bright overhead lights. It took a moment for her eyes to focus, but when they did, they locked immediately onto my parents. Her survival instincts kicked in before her brain was even fully awake. She immediately adopted the persona she had perfected over a lifetime. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, innocent suffering. "Mom, Dad," she croaked, her voice hoarse from the intubation tube. "It hurts. Everything hurts so much." Oh, she waited for the inevitable rush of affection. She expected my mother to throw her arms around her, weeping. She expected my father to boom with righteous anger, demanding better pain medication for his precious angel. But they did not move. They remained frozen at the foot of the bed, staring at her as if she were a dangerous animal in a cage. Chloe frowned, confused by their unnatural stillness. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an explanation. Then she saw me. I was standing near the door with Andre, my arms crossed over my chest, wearing my blue scrubs and my chief of surgery badge. Chloe's heart monitor immediately spiked, the steady rhythm jumping into a rapid, panicked cadence. Her eyes widened in absolute terror and pure, calculated malice. "What is she doing here?" Chloe shrieked, her raspy voice breaking. "Make her leave right now, she hurt me." My parents remained completely silent, watching the performance unfold. Chloe mistook their silence for hesitation and doubled down on her vicious lies, pressing the only button she thought would work. "Mom, Dad, listen to me," Chloe cried out, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "I remember the surgery. I woke up while she was cutting me. She did this on purpose. She tried to kill me on the operating table for revenge. I swear she intentionally hurt me. You have to call the police. You have to get her arrested. She is a drug addict. She should not be a doctor. Do not let her near me." Her near. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her lies was breathtaking. She had just survived a massive, catastrophic medical event entirely because of my surgical skill. I had stood over her bleeding body for 3 hours, meticulously repairing the damage she had inflicted upon herself with her own reckless drug abuse. And the very first words out of her mouth were a calculated attempt to frame me for attempted murder. She was exactly the same monster she had been 3 years ago. She had not changed. She had not learned a single thing. She still believed that she could manipulate reality simply by crying and pointing her finger at me. But this time the spell was completely broken. 3 years ago, my parents would have instantly believed her. They would have attacked me. They would have called hospital security to have me forcibly removed and stripped of my medical license. Today, they did absolutely nothing. My mother looked at Chloe's trembling, pointing finger and then slowly lowered her gaze to the floor. She could not even bear to look at the monster she had created. My father crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his face trembled. He stared at his golden child with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Chloe's frantic cries slowly faded into a confused, heavy silence as she realized her performance was not working. She looked from my father to my mother, her panic genuine now. "Mom, Dad, why are you just standing there? Did you not hear what I said? She tried to kill me. Where is Jamal? I want my husband. Get Jamal in here right now." My father finally spoke, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "Jamal is currently being detained by hospital security in the waiting room," my father said coldly. "He is waiting to be handed over to the Atlanta Police Department for federal wire fraud." Chloe froze. The color completely drained from her already pale face, leaving her looking like a corpse. "What?" she whispered. "What are you talking about? Jamal is a millionaire. He is a successful real estate investor. We know about the offshore accounts, Chloe." Andre interjected, stepping forward into the light so she could see him clearly. "We know about the Delaware Shell Company. We know about the fake crypto investments. We know about the leased cars and the foreclosure on your house. And most importantly, we know about the bank wire transfer from October 12th, 3 years ago." Chloe's heart monitor let out a loud, continuous warning beep as her heart rate skyrocketed. She stared at Andre, her mouth opening and closing in absolute shock. "We know you wired your entire $150,000 tuition fund directly into Jamal's gambling account." Andre continued, his voice relentless. "We know you orchestrated the entire lie to cover his debts and framed your sister to protect yourself. And we know that your husband just embezzled $100,000 from your father's church. Your entire life is a fraud." Chloe looked desperately at my parents, searching for any sign of forgiveness or denial. But there was nothing. They were completely empty. The realization that she had been entirely exposed, that her entire kingdom of lies had been burned to the ground, finally hit her. She let out a loud, pathetic sob, burying her face in her hands. That was when I started to laugh. It started as a low chuckle deep in my chest and quickly grew into a full, cold, genuine laugh that echoed brightly off the sterile walls of the intensive care unit. It was the laugh of a woman who had finally been completely released from a lifetime of unearned guilt and toxic manipulation. It was the sound of absolute freedom. I stopped laughing and walked slowly toward the side of her bed. I reached into the large front pocket of my scrubs and pulled out a thick, stapled document. I had printed it out at the nurse's station before we walked in. It was the preliminary itemized hospital bill for an emergency open heart surgery, a complex synthetic aortic graft, an extended stay in the surgical intensive care unit, and the required battery of high-grade pharmaceutical drugs. I stood over her, looking down at her pathetic weeping form. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I raised my hand and casually dropped the thick stack of papers directly onto her lap. The heavy thud made her flinch. Chloe slowly pulled her hands away from her face and looked down at the document. Her eyes widened as she read the massive, bold number printed at the bottom of the final page. $320,000. "Since Jamal let your premium health insurance lapse 8 months ago for non-payment, you are entirely responsible for this balance out of pocket," I said, my voice perfectly calm and incredibly sharp. "And since your bank accounts are currently frozen under a federal fraud investigation, I expect you will have a very difficult time setting up a payment plan." Chloe looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "Nia, please," she begged, her voice a pathetic whisper. "You are my sister. I did not kill you on the operating table, Chloe," I said, leaning in slightly so she could see the absolute coldness in my eyes. "I saved you. I stood over your broken, drug-addicted body, and I meticulously put your heart back together piece by piece. I gave you your life back, so you can live long enough to pay me back every single penny you owe me." Chloe stared at the thick stack of papers resting heavily on her lap. The bold print of the $320,000 balance seemed to brand itself directly into her retinas. She opened her mouth to argue, to scream her usual demands for someone else to fix her problems, but the words completely died in her throat. Her eyes darted frantically around the sterile room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. She looked at my face and finally realized that the older sister she used to bully was entirely gone. I was not the family scapegoat anymore. I was the executioner, and I was holding the absolute final judgment in my hands. She let out a pathetic, whimpering sound, sinking deeper into the stiff hospital pillows. The sheer magnitude of her financial debt, combined with the terrifying reality of Jamal's impending federal wire fraud charges, broke her completely. Her carefully constructed life of luxury and privilege had been instantly reduced to ashes. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears of absolute terror leaking into her hairline as her heart monitor beeped in a rapid, erratic rhythm. My mother watched her golden child completely shatter. The grand illusion of their perfect, wealthy life was evaporating into thin air right in front of her eyes. The reality of the massive medical debt, the stolen church funds, the exposed drug addiction, and the total lack of any financial safety net finally pushed Vivian over the completely frayed edge of her sanity. She turned away from the hospital bed and looked directly at me. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, desperate agony. The arrogant First Lady of the Greater Grace Fellowship was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, broken woman staring into the abyss of absolute ruin. She took a staggering step toward me, her hands outstretched and trembling violently. "Nia, please," my mother begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, miserable wail. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot demand this kind of money from her. We cannot help her pay it. We have absolutely nothing left." I stood perfectly still, watching her crumble. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply let her humiliating admission hang in the cold hospital air. "We have nothing left, Nia," my mother repeated, her voice dropping to a desperate, frantic whisper. She threw away the last shreds of her dignity and fell to her knees right there on the hard linoleum floor of the intensive care unit. She clutched the edges of her ruined emerald silk dress, looking up at me with wild, pleading eyes. "We lied about all of it. We took out a massive second mortgage on our house just to help them. We drained everything we had to keep Jamal's business afloat because we were so terrified of the church finding out he was a fraud. We gave him the church building fund because we were completely desperate to cover the mortgage payments and keep the bank from foreclosing. We are drowning, Nia. We are completely drowning. Please, you have to stop this. You are our daughter. We are your parents. You cannot destroy us like this. You have to forgive this medical debt and help us fix this mess." I looked down at the woman who had given birth to me. She was weeping hysterically, snot and tears smearing her expensive, flawless makeup across her face. She was begging for mercy from the daughter she had mercilessly thrown into the freezing rain 3 years ago. She dared to invoke the title of parent as if it were a magic spell that could instantly erase years of horrific emotional abuse and profound betrayal. It was a pathetic, miserable sight. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy for her. I felt a profound, incredible sense of closure. The universe had finally balanced the scales, and it had placed the sword of justice directly into my hands. I slowly lifted my calm gaze from my weeping mother and looked at Andre. He was standing just a few feet away, watching the entire pathetic scene unfold, with his usual calm, calculating demeanor. He caught my eye and gave me a single decisive nod. It was time for the final blow. It was time to completely sever the rotting toxic ties that bound me to this family once and for all. Andre reached into his pristine leather folder one last time. He did not pull out another hospital bill or a printed bank statement. He pulled out a thick, legally binding document printed on heavy ivory paper. The official seal of the Fulton County Superior Court was stamped vividly in bright red ink at the very top of the page. He walked slowly over to my father, who was still standing completely paralyzed at the foot of Chloe's bed, and held the document out toward him. My father stared at the legal paper as if it were a loaded weapon aimed directly at his chest. His chest heaved rapidly, but he did not make a single move to take it. He was completely frozen, trapped in a nightmare he could not wake up from. Andre did not wait for his permission. He simply dropped the heavy document onto the foot of the hospital bed, right next to my father's trembling hands. "What is that?" My father choked out, his booming pastoral voice reduced to a fragile, broken whisper. I stepped forward, closing the physical distance between us until I was standing right next to Andre. The air in the intensive care unit felt incredibly thin, heavily charged with the electricity of absolute righteous vengeance. I looked my father dead in the eyes, making sure he felt the full devastating weight of my next words. "I know all about the second mortgage, Thomas," I said, speaking with absolute ice in my veins. My voice cut through the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitors, loud, clear, and entirely merciless. "I know that you foolishly leveraged the only real asset you had left to bail out a pathetic con artist. I know that you have been struggling to make the minimum payments for the last 6 agonizing months. And I know perfectly well that exactly 90 days ago you completely stopped paying your lender altogether." My father's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. He gripped the metal railing of the hospital bed to keep himself from collapsing. "How do you know that?" He gasped, his breathing becoming erratic and shallow. "Because your lender got tired of waiting for a miracle, Pastor." I explained, my words striking him like physical blows. When a bank decides that a loan is entirely toxic, they sell it off to the highest bidder on the open market to quickly recoup their financial losses. They sold off your bad debt last week, and when they put your mortgage on the open market, Andre's private equity firm bought it. The silence in the room was absolute and entirely deafening. Even Chloe stopped crying, her breath catching painfully in her throat as she stared at me in horrified disbelief. My mother stopped weeping, her hands falling limply to her sides as the devastating words slowly registered in her panicked, terrified brain. "You do not owe the bank any more, Pastor Thomas." I stated, my voice echoing with terrifying absolute finality. "You owe me, and you are officially 90 days delinquent on your payments." The legal grace period expired yesterday afternoon. My father stumbled backward, his legs finally giving out completely beneath him. He crashed heavily into the small vinyl visitor chair in the corner of the room, his face turning a sickly, horrifying shade of gray. "You bought our house," he whispered, his mind completely unable to process the magnitude of his total defeat. "You bought the family home." "I did not just buy your house, Thomas," I corrected him smoothly, my tone completely devoid of any familial warmth. "I bought your debt. I own your financial ruin. And since you are in severe, undeniable default, I am exercising my absolute legal right to foreclose on the property immediately without any further warning or negotiation. The official county eviction notice will be securely pinned to your front door at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." My father grabbed his chest, letting out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. "But the church," he stammered frantically. "The parsonage is tied to that property. If we lose the house, we lose everything. Where are we supposed to go? We will be completely homeless." I tilted my head slightly, feigning a moment of thoughtful consideration before delivering the final lethal strike. "That sounds like a personal problem, Pastor. Perhaps you can ask Jamal to let you sleep in the back seat of his leased Porsche before the dealership repossesses it. Or maybe you can sleep on the floor of the church youth center." "Oh wait, you gave all that money away too." My mother let out a blood-curdling scream of pure agony, burying her face in her hands and sobbing so violently her entire body shook. Chloe simply stared at the ceiling, her heart monitor beeping frantically as the sheer totality of their destruction washed over her. They had absolutely nothing left. Their money was gone. Their reputation was completely destroyed. Their golden child was drowning in insurmountable medical debt. Their son-in-law was going to federal prison. And the beautiful, sprawling colonial home they used to project their fake generational wealth to the entire world now legally belonged to the daughter they had treated like absolute garbage. Checkmate. I whispered, the single word hanging in the air like an absolute death sentence. I looked at the three of them and felt an overwhelming wave of peace wash over my soul. This was the exact moment the heavy chains of my childhood trauma finally snapped and fell away. I did not need their conditional love. I did not need their fake approval. I had built a magnificent life entirely from the ashes they left me in. Andre stood tall beside me, his presence a constant reminder of the genuine love and fierce loyalty I had found outside of their toxic walls. He reached out and gently took my hand, intertwining his fingers with mine. We had executed the plan with absolute flawless precision. Every single lie they had ever told, every cruel, manipulative tactic they had ever used, had been systematically dismantled and weaponized against them. They were completely trapped in a prison of their own meticulous design. I stood tall in my blue surgical scrubs, looking down at the ruins of the Washington family empire, knowing that I was the one who had finally burned it to the ground. The heavy silence that followed my declaration was abruptly shattered by the sound of squeaking rubber soles against the linoleum. While my father was having a complete mental breakdown in the visitor chair and my mother was weeping hysterically on the floor, Jamal had correctly deduced that his protective shield was entirely gone. He realized that the wealthy family he had been leeching off of for 3 years was now completely bankrupt and facing immediate eviction. With all eyes focused on the catastrophic revelation of the foreclosed mortgage, Jamal decided to cut his losses. He slowly backed away from the foot of the bed, keeping his head down and inching quietly toward the sliding glass door of the intensive care unit. He thought he could simply slip out into the hospital corridor, take the emergency stairwell down to the lobby, and disappear into the humid Atlanta night before anyone realized he was missing. He made it exactly halfway out the glass door before Andre spoke. "Leaving so soon, Jamal?" Andre asked, his voice casual but laced with undeniable menace. He casually lifted his left arm, pulling back the cuff of his charcoal suit jacket to check his expensive silver wristwatch. "You really should stay. The grand finale is just arriving." Jamal froze, his hand resting on the metal handle of the sliding door. He looked out into the brightly lit hospital corridor, and his eyes widened in sheer terror. Stepping off the main elevators and walking purposefully down the hall were two broad-shouldered detectives from the Atlanta Police Department. They were dressed in plain clothes with gold badges clipped prominently to their belts. They did not look like men who were interested in negotiating. They walked with the heavy, synchronized stride of law enforcement officers who already had a signed warrant in their hands. Jamal immediately let go of the door handle and took a frantic step backward into the room, bumping into a heavy medical cart. The crash made Chloe jump in her bed. Jamal looked around wildly like a trapped rat, but there was absolutely nowhere left to run. The two detectives stepped through the sliding glass door, completely blocking the only exit. "Jamal Davis." The lead detective asked, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that commanded instant compliance. Jamal swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "I want my lawyer." He squeaked, his false bravado entirely gone. "You are going to need a very expensive one," the detective replied, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Jamal Davis, you are under arrest. We have federal warrants out of the state of Delaware for multiple counts of wire fraud, criminal embezzlement, and felony grand larceny. We also have active warrants regarding several $100,000 in unpaid gambling debts to interstate casinos. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, right now." Jamal hesitated, looking desperately toward my father. "Pastor Thomas, tell them. Tell them I am your son-in-law. Tell them it is a misunderstanding about the church funds." My father did not even look at him. He remained slumped in the vinyl chair, his eyes vacant, staring blankly at the wall. The man who used to command a congregation of 10,000 people could not even summon the strength to defend the fraud he had sacrificed his own daughter for. The second detective did not wait for Jamal to comply. He stepped forward, grabbed Jamal roughly by the shoulder, and spun him around, forcing his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly across the intensive care unit. It was the sound of absolute finality. "No!" Chloe screamed from her hospital bed, her voice tearing painfully through her newly repaired throat. "You cannot take him. He is my husband. Jamal, do something. Tell them you have the money. Dad, stop them." She thrashed violently against the sterile white sheets, her cardiac monitor blaring a high-pitched continuous alarm as her heart rate skyrocketed to a dangerous level. A team of ICU nurses rushed into the room, pushing past the detectives to stabilize her, injecting a heavy sedative directly into her intravenous line to keep her from tearing her fresh surgical incisions. Jamal did not fight back. He let the detectives pull him out of the room, his head hung low in absolute defeat. He was dragged down the pristine hospital hallway, the harsh fluorescent lights exposing him for the pathetic broke criminal he truly was. My mother watched Jamal disappear down the corridor, and then she completely lost whatever remaining grip she had on reality. The arrest was the final nail in the coffin of their public image. She scrambled across the floor on her hands and knees, ignoring the nurses who were desperately trying to calm Chloe down. She reached me and grabbed the fabric of my scrub pants and the hem of my white lab coat, which I had thrown on over my scrubs earlier. Her grip was tight, desperate, and entirely manic. "Nia, please!" My mother wailed, her face completely distorted by her uncontrollable sobbing. "You have to stop this. You have to fix this. You are powerful here. Tell Andre to call the police off. Tell him to drop the foreclosure. We are the Washington family. We have generational wealth. We have a reputation to uphold. If the church sees Jamal in handcuffs, if they find out we lost the parsonage, we will be ruined. Our entire legacy will be destroyed. You must forgive us. God commands you to forgive your family." I looked down at the pathetic woman clinging to my coat. She was still trying to weaponize religion to save her bank account. She was still prioritizing the illusion of generational wealth over the daughter she had emotionally tortured. I reached down and grasped her wrists. My grip was not violent, but it was incredibly firm, completely unyielding. I forcefully peeled her manicured fingers off my white coat one by one and pushed her hands away. "Do not ever speak to me about generational wealth, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, completely steady cadence. "Your generational wealth was nothing but an illusion built on lies, arrogance, and stolen church funds. You have no legacy left to protect." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock at my physical rejection. "But we are your family," she whispered. "You stopped being my family 3 years ago," I replied, stepping back so I could look down at both her and my father. "You want to talk about the past? Let us talk about it. Let us talk about what I was doing while you were parading your precious golden child around the church, praising her fake accomplishments." My father slowly lifted his head from his hands, compelled by the raw, undeniable authority in my voice. "When you changed the locks and threw me out, I had exactly $42 in my checking account." I continued, my words slicing through the heavy air. "I slept in the back seat of my freezing Honda Civic in the hospital parking garage for 6 solid months. I washed my hair in the public sinks of the hospital cafeteria bathrooms before my surgical rotations. I ate expired sandwiches out of the vending machines because I could not afford hot food. I worked as an orderly on the weekends, cleaning up blood and bodily fluids. I tutored underclassmen at night. I worked 3 different jobs just to keep my head above water, to pay my own tuition, and to survive the absolute hell you abandoned me in." My mother covered her mouth, fresh tears spilling over her cheeks, as the brutal reality of my survival finally penetrated her thick skull. "I built my life from the absolute ground up. I declared, standing as tall as I possibly could, radiating the immense power I had earned through my own blood, sweat, and tears. I became the youngest chief of cardiothoracic surgery in the history of this hospital. I married a man who actually loves and protects me. I built a real empire while you two were busy funding a fake one." I turned my gaze directly onto my father. He shrank back into his chair, unable to meet my eyes. "You stand behind a pulpit every Sunday, Pastor Thomas, and you preach the word of God," I said, my voice echoing with righteous condemnation. "You love to quote scripture to control your congregation. Well, let me remind you of a few verses you conveniently forgot. Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. You read that verse your entire life, but you never actually understood it until tonight." My father flinched as if I had physically struck him across the face. "And let us not forget Galatians 6:7. I continued relentless in my dismantling of their religious hypocrisy. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps exactly what he sows. You sowed cruelty, Thomas. You sowed arrogance, greed, and betrayal. You chose a con artist over your own flesh and blood because you cared more about appearances than the truth. And now you are reaping the harvest of your own monumental stupidity. The silence that followed my sermon was absolute. The nurses had successfully sedated Chloe, and she lay unconscious in her bed, completely unaware of the final judgment being passed. My parents were completely broken, stripped of their money, their home, their reputation, and their ridiculous religious superiority. They had nothing left to say. There were no more lies to tell, no more manipulations to try. They were completely cornered by the devastating consequences of their own actions. I looked at the two of them and realized that I did not hate them anymore. Hate requires energy. Hate requires attachment. Looking at them now shivering and ruined on the floor of my intensive care unit, I felt absolutely nothing. They were strangers to me. Pathetic, empty strangers. I turned to Andre. He gave me a soft, proud smile, offering his arm. I looped my arm through his, feeling the solid, comforting warmth of his presence. The eviction notice will be on your door at 8 in the morning. I said my final words to them, echoing coldly in the room. I suggest you go home and start packing whatever cheap clothes Jamal has not already pawned, because by tomorrow afternoon the locks will be changed, and unlike you, I will not let you stand on my porch in the rain. I will simply have you arrested for trespassing. Without another word, I turned my back on the Washington family. I walked out of the intensive care unit, the glass doors sliding shut behind me, sealing them inside the sterile prison of their own making. The heavy hospital air suddenly felt incredibly light, and I took my first deep breath as a completely free woman. I paused right at the threshold of the sliding glass doors, letting them hold open for just one final moment. I turned back to look at the room. My father, Thomas Washington, was sitting entirely flat on the cold linoleum floor, his long legs sprawled out in front of him, like a discarded marionette whose strings had been abruptly severed. He was staring blankly at the wall, completely broken by the absolute collapse of his financial and social empire. He had traded his own flesh and blood for a massive house and a fake millionaire son-in-law, and now he had absolutely nothing. On the hospital bed, Chloe was heavily sedated, but hot tears were continuously leaking from the corners of her closed eyes, soaking the sterile white pillows. Even in her chemically induced sleep, the crushing reality of her new existence was suffocating her. She was waking up to a dark world where she had no wealthy husband to fund her lavish lifestyle, no secret tuition money to steal, and a staggering $320,000 medical debt firmly attached to her name. Her golden child status was entirely useless now. It could not pay a massive hospital bill or bail her out of this bottomless hole. My mother Vivian remained on her hands and knees, her ruined emerald silk dress pooled around her. She had descended into a catatonic state of silent weeping, rocking back and forth, as she finally realized no one was coming to save her. The congregation she valued over her own daughter would soon find out about the embezzled building fund, and she would be forced to face the exact public humiliation she had spent her entire life desperately avoiding. I reached up and unclipped my chief of surgery identification badge from my white lab coat. My long shift was officially over, and my duties as a doctor to this specific patient were completely fulfilled. I held the smooth plastic badge in my hand, looking down at the pathetic ruins of the family that had tried so incredibly hard to destroy me. 3 years ago, you threw me out in the freezing rain and told me I was dead to you. I said, my voice carrying an absolute finality that echoed off the thick glass walls. You told me never to come back. You got your wish. My father slowly shifted his vacant eyes toward me, but did not have the strength to speak a single word. The daughter you had is dead. I continued, my words falling like heavy stones into the silent room. She died on that front porch while you watched her freeze. I am not your daughter. I am not your sister. I am just the landlord who is taking her property back. I slipped the badge into my pocket. I reached out and firmly linked my arm through Andre's, offering him a genuine smile. He smiled back, his eyes filled with immense pride and unwavering love. Without another word, we turned our backs on the wailing, devastated family and walked out of the surgical intensive care unit. The glass doors shut completely, sealing the Washington family inside their brightly lit prison. The chaotic sounds of their weeping and the frantic beeping of the cardiac monitors were instantly muted by the soundproof glass. We walked together down the pristine, quiet hospital hallway, leaving the toxic chaos of my blood relatives far behind. The polished floors reflected the soft overhead lighting, creating a path of calm serenity before us. With every step away from that room, the invisible weight I had carried my entire life evaporated completely. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was exactly who I had worked so tirelessly to become. The hospital staff nodded respectfully, but I barely registered them. My mind was focused entirely on the brilliant future outside these walls. The rhythmic squeak of my clogs against the tile felt like a victory march. We pushed through the double doors of the main entrance and stepped into the warm, humid Atlanta night. The city air smelled like blooming jasmine, a sharp, comforting contrast to the sterile bleach of the operating room. The vibrant lights of the downtown skyline sparkled in the distance, a beautiful, sprawling testament to ambition and resilience. It was a city where I once slept in my freezing car, and it was now a city that I essentially owned. We walked toward Andre's sleek black car, parked securely in the executive lot. I looked up at the dark sky, feeling a profound sense of absolute victory. I had not just survived the vicious betrayal of my family, I had conquered it completely. I had built an untouchable career, accumulated immense personal wealth, and found a brilliant partner who valued my strength. The people who tried to bury me were now permanently trapped under the dirt of their own lies. Andre quietly unlocked the car door and held it open for me, but I paused for a brief moment before getting in. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back slightly, and took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs completely with the warm night air. I held it for a second, savoring the absolute quiet peace of my new reality. Then I let it out in a long, deeply satisfied exhale.